Running back and quarterback prospect talk, where they might land, what it could mean for the post-draft ADP landscape. That's what we're talking about today on Stealing Bananas. I'm Ben Gretch. You can find my newsletter at bengretch.substack.com. With me, as always, is Shawn Siegele. You can find all of his great work over at RotoViz. And Shawn, a couple of weeks ago, we dug into the wide receiver class, the prospects, the key names to know in depth. We have not really dug into the running backs yet on the show. You've had an opportunity to talk about your favorite prospects on some other pods. Obviously, the RotoViz Rookie Guide is a very important resource for anyone listening to get all of Shawn's thoughts on this type of thing. But I always love to get your thoughts on the running backs. I'm pretty... obviously running back's a different type of position, right? In terms of the prospects, we care a little bit more about opportunity. We care a little bit more about fit. We care about some of those things, whereas at wide receiver, it's a little bit more skill-based. I like to really, focus my analysis in the areas where I feel like it actually matters, whereas over the years at running back, sometimes you try to peel back the layers on skill, and it is tougher to identify, and certainly the usage and the fit and draft capital and all those things are going to matter a ton as well. So we're going to learn a lot from the NFL draft. And a lot of people have said that about this particular class as well. There's no real premium running back prospect in this class. There's a couple good ones that are kind of at the top. And then the next group feels like a really big group, and everyone's kind of just waiting for the draft capital and landing spot sort of lottery, and then they're going to rank them all that way, or at least that's the way that it's being discussed. But we've talked a lot about on the show, and you've talked about in the past, definitely, how trying to nail down some of these elements of running back skill and talent matter probably more than the market understands. And so wanting to talk through some of those prospects a little bit with you today, get an understanding of guys that, that if they land on day two, maybe in round 4, good landing spot, that they could be really interesting because of their profile, because their profile is interesting and those things. And one of the fun things about this show is it will, in a lot of ways, be a preview for what we're going to be doing next Friday, the day 2 show. The last couple of years we've done this, Shawn, where we've done a live show over on YouTube, on the RotoViz Radio YouTube channel, talking through everything from day 2. We typically spend a decent amount of time also recapping round 1, which is the Thursday night event. And then we'll be recording on Friday. So for anyone who wants to come hang out for that live show, definitely make sure to be there. This will be today's episode, in the Stealing Banana shorts that come from it will be our last pre-recorded show before the NFL draft. So we're going to talk through some of these prospects. We're going to talk through some of these names. It will be fun then to potentially celebrate on Friday as they land in some spots, or even, maybe some of these running backs, or certainly some of these quarterback discussions that we're going to have will be first round considerations. And we'll be talking about them on day 2 a little bit as we recap the first round as well. But Shawn, the draft's almost here. I'm excited. There's a lot that we're going to learn. This does feel like a class where these landing spots are going to be really interesting. Some of these teams, especially with the running back position, some of these teams are so clearly positioning themselves. We were talking a little before the show. It feels like certainly the Chargers are. They're going to go a little bit more run heavy. They've brought in Gus Edwards, but I think part of the reason people have gotten really excited about Blake Corum and a lot of the pre-draft best ball drafts is his college head coach is now with the Chargers, and that feels like such a good landing spot. Whoever lands there, people are going to be really excited about. The other obvious one is Dallas, where they let Tony Pollard go. They had these little rumors, we might bring in Ezekiel Elliott, but they haven't done anything with that. It's wide open in Dallas. It's very clearly we're going to see what happens in the draft before we do anything else at that position. Those 2 landing spots feel like the home runs for the rookies. And there's just so much more that will come, but there's always surprises during the draft. So it's going to be super fun to talk through all of that with you next week.
It will be. And I'm really looking forward to this show. We're going to talk running backs. We're going to talk some QBs, as you mentioned. It'll be in some ways similar, but, with some tweaks to what we did last week. Obviously, we did the broken ADP. Thanks to everybody who responded to that and enjoyed it. Obviously, drafts are wrapping up here, so it won't be as much of a broken ADP emphasis, but thinking through how these landing spots are going to change how we see certainly the post-draft ADP landscape. And I think in some ways, pretty significantly, Ben. As we get going here at running back, you mentioned obviously the Chargers and the Cowboys. Both of those teams set up to, have a potentially a rookie starter, as you mentioned. And the Cowboys could be very dynamic on offense. And that didn't exactly trickle down to Tony Pollard the way people hoped last year, but it certainly could to whoever starts for them this season. We know that the Chargers are going to have a much more competent team this next year. They're going to emphasize the run. They're still going to have Justin Herbert. So this could be a team where even if they don't light up the scoreboard, the running backs could score quite a bit. So focusing on those two spots, I think makes a lot of sense. I actually have two additional spots where I think that running backs could be the starters, and that would be with the New York Giants, where you have Devin Singletary there signed as the free agent addition. I love Devin Singletary, but I also always kind of assume that the team that he's on there is going to be looking for another guy. At the very least, you're going to have a committee in that situation. And then we have what I would say is a pretty weak depth chart with the Las Vegas Raiders with Zamir White and Alexander Mattison, to where a rookie who is decent drafted into that situation, not just from a committee perspective, but I think you're potentially looking at a starter. So we could have as many as 4, which that kind of circles us back around to this question of, do we have 4 guys who can legitimately start in this draft? Also have quite a few other spots where I think the rookie could be the backup. And then just to kind of, help myself out and remind myself what's likely to happen with these teams, I have another 10 to 15 teams where I think they are actually a stealth threat to take a rookie who would be relevant. Now, that's going to mean different things for different teams. I think we could see almost all of the backs from this class go on day 3, which means that you're not necessarily going to get the information that you need to sort through these guys. One of the reasons why we want to focus some on the talent, or at least the profiles of these guys today. But even for these teams who appear to have, a decent depth chart, one of the things that we know is the draft isn't going to be that efficient, and teams are going to go with the players that they like, the guys who are, quote unquote, like the top guy on our board when you get deeper into these drafts. And then, that can really foul up what you're looking at. So we can kind of work through some of those depth charts as well, as we kind of think of where the best spots are for certain guys. So I also have the names attached to some depth charts here. Ben, it won't surprise you to find out that the Kansas City Chiefs and the number 2 spot there is one that I think is relevant to Chiefs fans, but also could be very relevant to fantasy football. Where would you like to start us here with this discussion, as we're probably looking at 2 guys at the top?
Well, I think maybe before we jump into the players, let's talk about some of those teams, because I'm really interested to hear some of your thoughts about those different backfields. I have some that immediately come to mind for me as well. 2 of the backs going in the early rounds, in the very early range, I should say, of early best ball drafts that I've been a little bit concerned about the reality draft for. And then I've also questioned in both cases whether I'm sort of overstating that. And I'm curious if they're on your list, are Kyron Williams and Devon Achane and the Rams in Miami. I think in Miami, they do have other backs there, obviously Raheem Mostert. And I don't necessarily think Achane's profile is one that is impacted by another running back. You were kind of talking about guys who could come in and be a starter or a backup. Part of what I was thinking for these 2 is they're going so high that if a running back was added, it might just impact their cost, because people might assume that their share of the backfield might come down a little bit. It might be more of a committee than they were anticipating. I don't know that that's a lock in Miami, but certainly with Raheem Mostert being the age that he is, I think they like some of the other guys they have, Jeff Wilson, Salvon Ahmed, but It wouldn't really surprise me if they try to add to that position again. They seem to always sort of be adding to skill position with certain talents that they like and things like that. The Rams one seems pretty obvious to me, actually, where they went into last season with Cam Akers on the roster, and that had been sort of an issue in the prior season, and it really blew over in a way that they decided they needed to get rid of him in season. They traded him in season. And then when Kyron Williams goes down onto IR, they're bringing in Darrell Henderson. They're bringing in, they had Royce Freeman on their practice squad, and they're using those two guys for 4 weeks. And then the second Kyron Williams is ready again, they're like, we need to get Darrell Henderson out of here again, which the whole thing has been with, his career has been maybe not the best locker room presence or those types of things. Or at least that's been sort of an assumption that's been made. But they were seemingly in break glass in case of emergency mode and really didn't want to go to Zach Evans yet and some of those things. So they seem like a really obvious one to not plan to go into this year as thin as they were last year. As soon as they got rid of Akers, they really thinned things out, and then they felt the impact of that when Kyron Williams got hurt. So were those two teams were the first two that popped in my mind when you made that comment, as well as the Chiefs also popped into my mind, but you already mentioned them. But were the Rams and Dolphins two that were on your list?
It's interesting that those pop up. I do have the Rams as a pretty straightforward spot there. You look at their roster currently, and they have Ronnie Rivers and Zach Evans behind Williams. I guess for me, though, even if they go that direction, it maybe isn't as impactful as it is for some other guys, because we know that they loved Williams and felt like he was so perfect for what they wanted to do. We know kind of in retrospect that they loved him going into the season, and then were proven right on that one. And so now I guess I just think Williams is set for a massive, massive workload.
And one of the things that I pitched to you as a potential idea for a show this week, we'll probably do it in a couple of weeks, but it's this idea of like team trends that we actually trust, because I think there should be kind of a sliding scale with that. One of the team trends I trust is Sean McVay likes a workhorse back. I mean, he wants a guy that he can just play every single down. So, I mean, even if they add a day 3 back, I mean, he's probably just a backup to Kyron Williams. I think you're right. He's probably set for a big role regardless.
The other thing there is that they had some chances to completely get rid of Zach Evans last season, as obviously they hadn't spent much on him from a draft perspective. I think the fact that he didn't get opportunities when they needed somebody, when Williams went down, has basically everybody off of him, and I think probably accurately. And yet, as a Zach Evans believer, I'm hoping that part of what was happening there is they just didn't think that he was ready, and they didn't want to put a guy out there who's going to hurt them for winning 2023 games, because that was their objective at the time. I think that Evans is actually much more talented than most of the guys in this class. And so if you're thinking that a guy was a developmental prospect, for me, Evans is someone I'm kind of keeping the light on for, and I'm hoping that he ends up being that guy as opposed to a back in this particular class. The HN one is also interesting in that, I mean, I think that Mostert was so good last season, and despite his age, I think that we can kind of actually count on him being pretty decent again. I think that his ADP is broken. I think he's an interesting guy from the perspective of, yeah, I mean, if he were being drafted, like obviously if HN and Mostert's ADPs were reversed, everybody would be like, well, that obviously makes no sense, and you're going to go with the younger guy. But for the gap to be as big as it is right now, given what they did last season respectively, I think is also a little bit interesting and arguably exploitable in the direction of Mostert. I also think we have a situation here with the Dolphins where they used a pick last season on running back when, yeah, I mean, it worked out. It was the right pick. They got their guy. He looks like he's going to be absolutely fantastic if he can stay healthy. And yet they didn't have many picks in last year's draft, and they have a looming salary cap disaster. So are you going to use more picks at running back when probably what the Dolphins need to do is to desperately build out the depth of their overall roster? And we saw last season that the injuries just completely, torched what looked like might be, a magical run to the Super Bowl before all those injuries happened. Now, you're probably never going to be able to overcome that level of injury when it's happening, to both sides of the ball. And yet, I mean, the Dolphins are in a push to try and win the whole thing before things, get too cataclysmic there. And so I guess I think that they're probably set at running back. And yet, again, every time we think somebody is set, then you do tend to get some more guys there. The spots,
but that's a good note that I hadn't considered about them being a little bit lighter on picks and cap space. Typically, those types of teams aren't going to worry about, especially if they already have reasonable depth. I think that's a really good case you made for Raheem Mostert, not needing to replace him, trying to trust him again. The draft community has been probably undervaluing him for a couple of years now, thinking that all those injuries he had earlier in his career, like he's now past 30 years old. At age 31 last year, Shawn scores 21 touchdowns to lead the NFL, had scored 19 in his career previously. So age 31 is that season where you can score more than your whole 20s combined. Now he's going into the age 32 season, and people still don't. I mean, he scored 21 touchdowns last year, and he's going in like the 9th round or something, 8th round, 9th round. But
and I mean, Achane is going to be the guy. And yet, when you look at what injuries did to them last year, I mean, he was the back who couldn't stay healthy. Raheem Mostert is going to absolutely annihilate that ADP. There are some
you don't usually see the league leader in touchdowns go that late. You usually don't see it.
I do think there are some spots, though, where we're going to get some picks that change things pretty dramatically. One of the guys that Pat and I discussed a little bit on Ship Chasing a week and a half ago or so was James Cook, and he was making the case that that's a guy that you need to target relatively early, kind of the case that we made for some players last season. And I love James Cook, and he was one of the guys I thought you should target last year, and then he does some interesting things. And I don't like the fact that my current ranking on him doesn't necessarily let you get in. Certainly doesn't give you a good exposure, but I mean, the Bills are going to add another back there. And if it's someone interesting at all, then I think it's going to push Cook down to around my ranking, and then hopefully ADP drops further, and then you can get him. So I think that's a possibility. The other two that could be very impactful is that, I mean, the Bucks need someone to go with Rachaad White, and the Cardinals need someone to go with James Conner. And if we get interesting names in those two spots, then I think it makes it easier to avoid those guys if that's what you want to do. And if you want to load up on them, I think it'll make them a little bit less expensive, so you can go ahead and do that. So it kind of works either way. Are those three spots areas where you could see, pretty decent backs landing and muddying the waters?
Yeah, I can definitely see those. I think all the ones that you've mentioned have made sense and been interesting. The Giants one was definitely a strong one, and a reason I've been really hesitant to pull the trigger on Devin Singletary at all. I think it just makes sense after you let Barkley go to be like, okay, well, we're going to get the Barkley replacement, the long-term thing. Like Singletary's the bridge, the bridge running back. We talk about it at quarterback, bridge quarterback, but that's an obvious one. The others that you just named, I haven't taken a lot of James Conner either for similar reasons, and as Singletary, and I think you are right there that they're probably going to add. And Pacheco's another one that I've had a hard time taking. It's the running back landscape is interesting. I'm probably over responding a little bit because we do know that this incoming rookie class isn't that strong. And so how much can these incumbents really be impacted by the draft is a fair question. And to your point, a lot of these guys might not even be, off the board until day 3. But those are interesting ones. James Cook's the one that I maybe hadn't thought through as much, but also I think makes a ton of sense. Last year they tried to add Leonard Fournette in season, didn't really pan out. I'm looking at their depth chart right now. Their backups are Ty Johnson and Darrington Evans. That's not how they're going to go into this season. They had Latavius Murray as well last year. He's currently a free agent still. They brought in Damian Harris thinking that they would get more out of him. He could just never get right. He retired this offseason. kind of a bummer to see that for me, frankly, because I always thought he was a really good back, but it seems like health he's still very young. It seems like health was just not something he was going to ever come back from. Some of the lingering issues that he's had. They have not done anything to address. And then they also lost Naheem Hines, who they had on the roster, So you're talking about a lot of change in their backup running back spots and likely adding something there. Although they're also, obviously huge candidates to add a wide receiver too and have other needs too. So we'll see how things work out for them.
The fun ones for me in terms of trying to project the Giants, right? Because you look at who's going to be their starting quarterback. Well, I think it's going to be Daniel Jones, but we'll talk about the fact that they're supposedly very much in the mix for a QB. You talk about who's going to be the starting running back, quite possibly a rookie. You talk about who's going to be their wide receiver one, hopefully for them, maybe Malik Neighbors. One of the reasons they weren't that great last year, Ben, is that they need to replace all three of those positions. It wasn't an extremely talented offensive depth chart last year in New York. Now, granted, last year they had Barkley, and now they don't. So that's one of the reasons why you're having to kind of make those moves. But that one is interesting. And then I guess the other one that I actually do have listed as both a starter and a backup, or at the very least a committee, but I think that we could potentially see a rookie, even if it's not one of the top two guys, jump both of those players, would be with the Cincinnati Bengals, which is another team that's going to be very relevant for fantasy. We would expect the running back there to score some points.
I was going to ask you about that because in the early going, we weren't really kind to Zach Moss in season on stealing bananas last year. He had some really good numbers. We emphasized that when you watch the games, he had some long runs that were just really well blocked and some stuff just kind of panned out, but he didn't really look that explosive in some of those things. I have been sort of wanting to fade, even though he got, a decent contract and got some money. I've taken him a couple of times when he slid, but it's kind of, to me, been an analogous situation to how I've been playing the Steelers the last couple of years, where I've wanted to fade the de facto early down starter. The Najee Harris type is, in my mind, Zach Moss, who I don't think is like an explosive player and is probably just a volume play, and instead go after the more exciting, more explosive secondary player that I think is going to play a lot, which would be Jaylen Warren in the Steelers situation. And here is Chase Brown. But my issue with the Chase Brown thing is I'm not convinced that, and so this is to your point and in agreeing with your point, that the Bengals are as convinced in Chase Brown as the fantasy community is. We all fell in love with how explosive he looked down the stretch. He clocked, I believe, the fastest time of a ball carrier, if not at the running back position, maybe of any player in the NFL last year. He had a really high on-field miles per hour play on one of his long touchdowns late in the year. But he also was behind Travion Williams for a spell as the number 2. And I think people think that he played more than he did. He finished with 58 touches last year. It's a very, very small sample. He was a day 3 pick, a round 5 guy. They did use him some down the stretch, but the Bengals also, people maybe will forget, missed the playoffs. So we didn't get like an opportunity to see if that would extend into the playoffs. His last 4 games, he played 19% of the snaps, 22, 15%, 28%. It's not like he was playing 40 or 50% of the snaps at any point either. He never played more than 20 offensive snaps in a game all season for them. Down the stretch, he was in double-digit snaps every single week for the final 6 weeks. But prior to that, he only had like 9 offensive snaps total before looks like about week 13. So it's a profile where I think fantasy managers got excited. He did some interesting stuff down the stretch, had some explosive plays. But it wouldn't be surprising if the Bengals are like, we need a backup running back. They're maybe not viewing him as that answer that fantasy drafters right now are, as he goes in about the round 10, round 11 range, in that premium 0 RB range. He's very interesting. And if he survives the draft, I'm going to like him a lot. I think that later in the summer and probably ahead of Moss. But at the current moment, I think that's a really good call from you. I want to ask you about 2 teams that I think might not be on your list, because there's 2 sort of in the idea of sort of broken ADPs, but I'm curious maybe if they are, or what your take is on these backfields. Because there's 2 guys that are going as the 3rd running back in their backfield and very low basically undrafted in every draft that I'm doing. Our buddy Pete Overzet did a video this offseason about how scrolling down in these late rounds can be a really valuable strategy to get players that are sort of low ownership players in best ball contests that are not drafted a lot. And these two running backs are guys that I've wanted to add at the ends of my slow drafts that I'm doing here to close out my running back builds. The first one is in Denver, where we like Jaleel McLaughlin a lot, but Sean Payton has used three backs plenty of times in his career. Samaje Perine still has a pretty big contract. They could save I think it's $4 million if they were to cut him. But if they haven't done it by now, I'm kind of curious why they would. They just signed him to a 2-year deal last year, and they used him a decent amount in his first year. They seem to like him. I like Javonte Williams' price right now, but I think Perine's for a guy who's basically undrafted in most drafts, in line for a decent amount of work. A lot of those late running back picks end up being total zeros. This is a guy that I think can factor into best ball builds and be a reasonable RB6 if he's, you're adding him to the end of your build. And then the other one is in Jacksonville, where drafters are very confident, I think, that Tank Bigsby is going to be the backup. And it makes sense. He was a 3rd-round pick last year. He's the young guy. But he was bad last year. They gave the backup job to D'Ernest Johnson halfway through the year, and D'Ernest Johnson is still on the roster. And so he's the other one who's going completely undrafted in every draft. Bigsby goes at the very late part of drafts, but I'm not convinced that the Jaguars think Tank Bigsby is their long-term backup. They replaced him. They gave that job to Johnson and basically stopped playing Bigsby entirely around mid-season last year. And I think people maybe have forgotten that, or just defaulting to, young player, year 2, he's going to be the backup running back. Perine and D'Ernest Johnson are those two. When you say broken ADPs at running back, those are not the guys that should be coming to mind, but they are guys that, to me, when I've been scrolling through the late rounds, I'm like, these guys should be getting drafted, I think.
Yeah, especially when you compare them to rookie running backs who are just so thin to end up as anything more than a 3rd stringer and might go completely undrafted. I mean, partly what you're hoping to do when you draft those rookies is to hit on a guy who, makes a 3, 4, 5 round ADP jump. Colin and I, drafted a bunch of guys that fit that mold on our OT show this week. And yet, I mean, for most of the players, the thesis is just so thin. Whereas, so for me, it does kind of separate into 2 different categories, where I think that Samaje Perine is a really weird guy to not be getting picked, because he's a 3-down back, in that if you need a guy who can score touchdowns and can catch passes, he's going to be fine. And if the offense is better, and if either of the other guys who are trendy get hurt, then you're suddenly looking at a valuable player. And even if nothing happens, you're potentially looking at a valuable player. He's a guy where, it's not fun to draft him, and so people don't, but he perfectly fits what you're describing right there. For me, Bigsby is actually the guy who is kind of interesting. And, part of this maybe goes back to what you were expecting. And there was a lot of buzz around Bigsby during the draft last season. And then he had an impressive preseason, and there was even more buzz.
It held down Travis Etienne's ADP for a bit. He was going to take all the high-value touches from Travis Etienne. That was a concern for people.
And I
guess he got one goal line carry in the first preseason game. Do you remember that? That was the one goal line carry heard around the world. That was a big discussion point after that first game.
And for me, Bigsby never had that profile. I mean, the gap between Etienne and Bigsby from a talent perspective is absolutely massive. On the other hand, when you're looking at Tank Bigsby, he really does fit what you want from, a really solid backup and someone who can take some of the work. And I think that what we saw with him was simply that the Jaguars' offense was an absolute train wreck from a coaching perspective. And so that made it difficult for everybody. And it really did torpedo a lot of what Travis Etienne could have done too. But Bigsby then made some key mistakes that when they come from a rookie, the coaching staff can sour on him quickly and not want him out there to make those mistakes when you're also kind of running an overall approach that's given you a much slimmer margin in all of your games than I'm sure what the Jaguars were really wanting. They have said, and you've got to be very skeptical about coach speak all the time, but certainly at this time of the year as well, that was a mistake. and that they shouldn't have gone away from him as much, and that they still believe in him, and they think that he'll be able to fill that role this season. So from that perspective, I think that if you didn't have really high expectations last year and you expect him just to be a backup and eventually work into that role, then 2024 would be on schedule for that, which is kind of what I see with him. And so I guess I feel pretty comfortable with Bigsby at the end of drafts, whereas
That makes sense.
D'Ernest Johnson maybe is a little bit of a throwaway pick for me, even though, I mean, it could work out. The other guy, I think.
I like just to jump in real quick. I like your classification of those two as different, that I had kind of pulled them together. And I think I've been feeling that way as well, because I'm just finishing up some slow drafts. I have taken Pirine a couple times. I have not actually gone down to D'Ernest Johnson and picked him. He's a little bit further down the list. I like your take on Bigsby. The other note I wanted to add on him, I think I said a minute ago that they went away from him and never went back to him. When they went away from him, they really went away from him. In a 5-game stretch, he played 2 offensive snaps, 1, and then 0. But then the final 2 games at the very end there, they went back to him 17 snaps, which was tied for a season high in week 17. And then he had 9 in week 18 as well. So the last 2 games, they did kind of get back into using him a little bit, which is usually a good sign. I mean, that might seem like I'm overstating that, but I thought they actually never went back to him. And then checking it here while we're talking, that's one of those signs that going into the offseason, it's like we're still committed to this day 2 pick that we had last year. I think it supports your point that they would be ready for him in year 2 to still be their backup.
So we'll kind of see how that works out. I mean, he's a guy where when I had him in FFPC Dynasty Leagues to back up ETN, he was a little bit of a tricky cut for me when you have to get down to the 16, even though for the reasons that you articulated, I did end up cutting him on all of the teams. And so then it's a question of, are you going to use one of those 5th, 6th, 7th round picks to draft him back and kind of keep him stashed there through the summer? Then the name who it's not a 3rd stringer, but I do think is interesting, I do think should be going in basically all of these drafts and probably a little bit earlier is the Abanikanda, where the upside for him in that Jets offense, I think, is absolutely extreme. And to really fully realize that you'd need an injury to Breece Hall, which would be emotionally devastating. I mean, Ben, I might not show up anymore for any fantasy-related activities if Breece Hall gets hurt. just kind of letting everybody know that that's probably the situation. But from a broader perspective, I think he's actually going to score quite a bit as the number 2 back there. That's one where I don't have them as a stealth running back pick, and I hope that I'm right. I may have just locked them in to drafting a guy who pushes Abanikanda down a spot. So we'll see how that portion of it works out. I think that we could get an interesting rookie behind Jonathan Taylor, which I don't think that affects his outlook any, but that's a spot where you might look for it. I think that we might get an interesting rookie behind Derrick Henry with the Ravens. Certainly Keaton Mitchell is a little bit of a wild card with the late season injury. I think we could get an interesting rookie in Cleveland to help Jerome Ford, because sadly Nick Chubb isn't going to be ready to start the season. And I mean,
they did bring in
are very all in on. I mean, the Browns should be a Super Bowl contender this year, and so they're not going to just be like, oh well, whatever happens in the first month is fine.
That's true, but they did bring in Deontay Foreman, Nyheim Hines. They have Pierre Strong, who they brought in season last year as well. That's a kind of deep running back group that maybe they feel like they already can float for Nick Chubb. The other ones you mentioned,
you're not going to convince me on any of those guys again, because I've had too much Deontay Foreman and Pierre Strong enthusiasm to think that suddenly they're going to start playing.
They just don't exist. So when you look at the depth chart, those lines are blank at this stage of their careers. The other names you mentioned do reinforce this point that there are a lot of intriguing spots. I mean, the other guy I kind of want to comment on is Keaton Mitchell. Did a little digging into his injury to kind of refresh myself. For anyone who's been thinking about him, there was some early optimism immediately that it was not multi-ligament. It was just the ACL. It was a clean tear. John Harbaugh's quotes after were like, this this was all when they went in and did the surgery. This was all what you would hope in terms of his timeline, and it all looks very positive. It was expected to be less of a, less devastating in terms of, there are scales of these things, whether there's another ligament that's damaged and all of that stuff. For Keaton Mitchell, it sounded, when I dug into it a little more, like, and for a young back like him, I was optimistic, and I've taken him a couple times as a result, thinking that if he is the backup for Baltimore this year, if he is able to get back and health-wise, it seems like that's possible, that he could be pretty interesting. But I think they probably, once you said that, I was like, you know what, they're going to add somebody. They always are adding depth at running back. So I think that's another really interesting one. You've named a bunch of teams that I think make a lot of sense. And again, we started just kind of glossing over the big ones, the Cowboys and the Chargers and some of those, the Giants, that the guys could come in and be starters immediately as well. There are a lot of probably available touches in at least committees and things like that, and a class that is not particularly strong, right? And so it's very interesting in terms of, there are guys in a lot of classes that people want to get really excited about, and then if they land in one of those spots that is this exciting, then everyone goes nuts. But all of these profiles people can pick some holes in,